My mother asked me to leave before dessert, glancing toward the driveway like she was checking a clock only she could see. The good china was still out, the last of the ham congealing under its foil, and somewhere in the kitchen my grandmother's old radio was playing carols. Nobody was really listening to anymore. I'd already pulled my coat off the back of my chair when the doorbell rang. My mother's whole face changed, the particular unraveling of someone who has been expecting one very specific knock and hears a different one instead. I set my coat back down. Whoever was standing on that porch, it clearly wasn't who she'd planned for, and in about 90 seconds, it was going to matter a great deal more than the pie. Welcome to Twist of Revenge, where ordinary families collide with the truth and the quiet ones win. My name is Sloan Whitaker. I'm 33 years old. I practice elder law in a small firm outside Elmwood, Wisconsin, which mostly means I spend my days making sure people in their 70s and 80s don't get quietly separated from everything they spent a lifetime building: their savings, their homes, their own say over what happens to either one. I'm good at that job because I understand exactly how patient real exploitation is, how it never announces itself, how it just waits, one small signature at a time. I never once expected to end up building that exact kind of case against my own family. I have to take you back 3 years, to the winter my grandmother had what everyone in my family still calls the little scare, because that's the winter everything quietly started. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitaker, Nell, to everyone who's ever loved her, raised my father, Frank, in the same white farmhouse on the edge of Elmwood where she still lives today. She taught 4th grade for 31 years, outlived my grandfather by almost 2 decades, and was, for my entire childhood, the single steadiest person in a family that otherwise ran on a fairly specific hierarchy. The farmhouse smelled like cinnamon and old paper for as long as I can remember, every windowsill lined with African violets she'd been propagating since before I was born, and there was a specific creak in the 3rd porch step that I could probably still identify blindfolded. My brother Derek was 2 years older than me, and from the time either of us could walk, the one my parents built their pride around. I was the one who got sent to Grandma Nell's house whenever the adults needed somewhere quiet to put me. I want to be fair, the way I try to be fair about every case that lands on my desk. My parents weren't cruel to me exactly. They were simply, consistently, more interested in Derek, his football scholarship, his contracting business, his opinions at dinner. I found my actual home 2 miles down the road, at Nell's kitchen table, doing homework while she graded papers, the radio playing the same classical station she's kept tuned in since 1988. She never once made me feel like a chapter she was waiting to get past. I remember one specific evening, the fall I was 13, sitting at that same table after a particularly bad day at school, and Nell, without asking a single question about what was wrong, simply set a plate of her burnt sugar cookies in front of me and said, "You don't have to tell me anything. I'll just sit here until you feel like talking, or you don't." I told her everything eventually, that night, the way I told her almost everything for the next 20 years. I don't think my parents ever once offered me that same quiet, patient kind of room to actually arrive in on my own terms. I chose elder law almost by accident, the way most people choose the thing that turns out to matter most. In my 2nd year of law school, I clerked for a legal aid clinic that handled guardianship cases, and my supervising attorney assigned me a file involving a woman named Dorothy Lindqvist, 79, whose live-in home health aide had spent 11 months quietly draining her checking account, one modest withdrawal at a time, small enough that no single transaction ever tripped a bank's fraud alert. By the time Dorothy's actual daughter noticed, from 3 states away, over $60,000 was gone. I sat in on the intake interview and watched Dorothy insist, gently and completely sincerely, that her aide would never do something like that, because the woman had been so kind to her, remembered her tea order, sat with her during the news each evening, never once raised her voice. I remember Dorothy's daughter sitting beside her, quietly crying into a paper napkin, not from anger at the aide, but from the specific grief of realizing her mother had been so starved for company that kindness alone had been enough to unlock everything. The case eventually resolved with a restitution order and the aide's license revoked, though Dorothy, I learned months later, still sent the woman a Christmas card that first year, unable to fully separate the kindness from what it had cost her. I understood, sitting in that clinic, that exploitation doesn't usually look like a stranger. It looks like the person who remembered to bring you your favorite tea. If you've ever watched someone you love get slowly, patiently taken advantage of by someone who was supposed to be caring for them, stay with me. This is going to take a while to tell right, and you're going to want to hear all of it. Nell's little scare, 3 winters ago, was genuinely minor. She'd gotten turned around driving home from the pharmacy, ended up 2 towns over, and called my father from a gas station, embarrassed more than frightened. A doctor's visit afterward found nothing beyond ordinary, age-appropriate memory lapses, nothing close to a dementia diagnosis. But it was enough to set my parents in motion. At a family dinner 2 weeks later, my father announced that Derek would be taking over power of attorney for Nell's finances, just to help her keep things organized. He said it the way he announces most decisions in our family, already finalized, delivered more as information than as a conversation. Nobody asked Nell, in that moment, what she wanted. Nobody asked me either, though I don't think anyone in that room considered, even for a second, that my actual professional opinion on power of attorney documents might be relevant to the conversation happening at my own family's table. I want to be honest about something. I didn't object loudly at the time. Derek was, on paper, a reasonable choice. Local, available, Nell's only grandson. I told myself my hesitation was just professional caution, the kind I'd have felt about any family taking this step without proper independent counsel for the elder party. I did not yet understand how right that instinct actually was. The small things started maybe 8 months in. I'd visit Nell on Sunday afternoons, the same as always, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd tried calling her old friend Marjorie Pruitt 3 times without ever getting through, which struck me as odd, since Marjorie had called our house every week for as long as I could remember. Nell mentioned, another Sunday, that Derek had handled some paperwork about the house, though she couldn't quite recall what kind, and when I asked her to clarify, she got a specific, quiet look on her face. Not confusion exactly, more like someone politely declining to admit she didn't fully understand something she'd already agreed to. One Sunday in particular, I noticed her checkbook sitting open on the counter, and out of habit more than suspicion, I glanced at the register. 3 entries in a row were written in handwriting that wasn't Nell's careful, looping cursive at all. Smaller, quicker, unmistakably Derek's. I stood there for a moment longer than I meant to, running my thumb along the edge of the page the way you'd check whether something was actually as solid as it looked. When I asked her about it, gently, she said Derek had started helping her keep the numbers straight, since her eyes weren't what they used to be. Which struck me as strange, since Nell's eyesight, as far as I knew, had never once been the problem. I brought it up at Easter that year, carefully, the way you'd raise a concern about any client's case rather than a family member's. I asked Derek, at the table, what the house paperwork had been about. He said easily, "Just some routine stuff, updating the deed for estate planning. Nothing you need to worry about." I asked, just as evenly, whether Grandma had a copy of it herself, or whether he'd kept the original. He didn't quite answer that part. My mother added, before I could ask a follow-up question, "Sloan, honey, not everything needs to be a legal matter. Grandma's fine. You always need something to fix." My father laughed, the specific laugh of someone agreeing with his wife without having to commit to the sentence himself. Nell across the table said nothing at all, which I understood, even then, as its own kind of answer. If you've ever raised a genuine concern about someone you love and been told, gently, that the real problem was your own need to find one, tell me in the comments. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how far this goes. I didn't let it go, though I got quieter about it in front of my family, which I understand now was its own mistake. I started visiting Nell more often instead, on weekdays when Derek wasn't likely to be there, bringing her actual mail in from the box myself, rather than trusting whatever version of it made its way to her by the time I usually saw her. I'd sit with her at the kitchen table sorting through catalogs and greeting cards, and over about 4 months, I built a picture I did not want to be building. a homeowner's insurance renewal notice for a policy amount that had dropped significantly from the year before, a letter from her bank confirming a large wire transfer she had no memory of authorizing, a real estate agent's business card tucked into a kitchen drawer for an agency 2 counties over that Nell had never once mentioned hiring, the card itself slightly bent, as though it had been handled more than once and then put away in a hurry. I did the thing I always do when the ground moves under me. I opened a case file, the same kind I'd open for any client, refusing to let myself conclude anything I couldn't yet support with a document. I want to be clear about something important here, because it matters professionally as much as personally. I could not ethically represent my own grandmother in a matter this directly tied to my own family. The conflict of interest would have been obvious and disqualifying the moment anyone looked at it closely. What I could do, and did, was document everything the way any careful person would, and bring it to someone who could actually act on it properly. Over those 4 months, I photographed every document I could reasonably access without prying, kept a dated log of every strange comment Nell made, and cross-referenced whatever I could against public records. The realty license attached to that business card, the recorded deed history on the house, the incorporation filing for Whitaker home renovations. I built it exactly the way I'd have built a case for a stranger, because I understood even then that treating it any less rigorously would only make it easier for someone to dismiss later. I brought my file to Barbara Coyle, the senior partner at my firm, a woman who'd been practicing elder law for over 30 years, and had, I'm fairly sure, seen every version of this particular story at least once. She read through everything without interrupting, laid it out across her desk in the order I'd built it, and was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Sloan, you understand you can't be the one who handles this." I told her I understood completely. "Then let's talk about who can," she said, "because this needs to go to Adult Protective Services, not into a family argument at your mother's table." I asked her honestly whether she thought I was overreacting, given that Derek had never once raised his voice to Grandma, never once seemed cruel in the ordinary sense. Barbara took off her glasses and looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Sloan, if a client walked in here tomorrow with this exact file about a stranger's grandson, would you hesitate to call it what it is?" I told her I wouldn't. "Then the fact that it's your own brother doesn't change the label," she said. "It just makes it harder to say out loud." Barbara walked me through the actual mechanics of a financial exploitation report, what evidence mattered, how an investigation typically unfolded, and gently, what it would likely cost me with my own family before it was over. "People rarely thank the person who reports this," she told me, "even when it saves them, especially then, sometimes. The relief usually comes years later, if it comes at all, and by then you may not even be the one standing close enough to receive it." I told her I understood that too. I did not yet understand it the way I would 11 months later. The trigger, when it actually came, wasn't dramatic. I drove past Nell's house on an ordinary Tuesday evening and saw a realty sign already staked into the front lawn, professional, polished, the kind that goes up only after paperwork most homeowners would remember signing. I actually drove past it the first time, telling myself I must have misread the address in the dim evening light, before circling back and parking directly across the street, staring at it through my windshield for a long moment before I made myself get out and knock on my own grandmother's door. If you've ever watched something quietly appear in front of you that told you exactly how much closer the people you love had already gotten to losing everything, without ever once asking permission, you understand exactly what that sign felt like. Nell answered the door in her housecoat, genuinely delighted to see me, and when I asked about the sign, she looked out at it for a long moment, with an expression I will never forget. Not denial, something closer to trying to locate a memory that should have been there and simply wasn't. "Derek mentioned something about the market being good right now," she said slowly. "I don't remember signing anything, but I suppose I must have. He's been so good about handling all of that for me." I sat with her at that same kitchen table where I'd done homework as a kid, and I did not correct her, because correcting a frightened 79-year-old woman about her own missing memory is not the same thing as helping her. I called Marjorie Pruitt myself that same week, using the number I still had saved from years earlier, and finally understood the missing phone calls. Marjorie told me carefully that she'd tried reaching Nell a dozen times over the past year, and twice had actually driven out to the farmhouse, only to be told by Derek, standing in the doorway, that Nell wasn't up for visitors that day, and that she'd call when she felt better. I told myself she just didn't want an audience while she wasn't feeling like herself, Marjorie said, her voice catching. We've been friends since 1974, Sloan. I should have pushed harder. I just didn't want to be the pushy old woman who couldn't take a hint. Marjorie had assumed, reasonably, that Nell simply didn't want to be seen while unwell. She had no idea, until I told her, that Nell had been asking after her the entire time, month after month, quietly wondering why her oldest friend in the world had simply stopped calling back. I filed the report with Wisconsin's Adult Protective Services Division on a Thursday night in March, sitting at my own kitchen table with copies of every document I'd gathered: the realty listing printed and dated, the wire transfer confirmation, Marjorie's account written up as carefully as I would have documented any witness statement for a client's case. The online intake form asked whether the suspected exploiter was a family member, and beneath that, in smaller text, whether the reporting party was also related to the victim. I typed yes, grandson, holds power of attorney, into the first field, and yes, granddaughter, into the second, and sat with my hands resting on the keyboard for a long moment before I let myself hit submit, the cursor blinking over a blank confirmation screen, like it was waiting for me to change my mind. I did not sleep well that night, or for several nights after. Not from doubt about whether I'd done the right thing, but from the specific, unfamiliar weight of having set something in motion that I could no longer take back or slow down, a feeling I imagine is not so different from what every client I've ever advised has felt sitting across from me in that exact same moment. The caseworker assigned to Nell's file, a patient, exacting woman named Lauren Feldman, called me 4 days later to confirm receipt and explain the process. These investigations move carefully, on purpose, she told me. We have to substantiate everything independently, interview your grandmother alone, without family present, more than once if needed, before we can take any action at all. I know that's going to feel slow from where you're sitting. She walked me through the general timeline: an initial welfare check, a review of financial records once subpoenaed, follow-up interviews, and finally, if substantiated, a referral to the county attorney's office for court action. I told her I understood. I did not, yet, fully understand how slow 11 months could actually feel from the inside. If you've ever had to file the one report you knew would blow up your entire family, and then simply wait, doing nothing else for months, stay with me, because what happened next took nearly a year to arrive, and you're going to want to see exactly how it landed. I told exactly one person outside of Barbara and Lauren. My friend Meg, who I'd known since our first year of law school, and who has never once told me to let something go, once she's watched me decide I'm not going to. She sat with me the night I told her, in my apartment, quiet for longer than I'd ever seen her go quiet, and then asked the only question that actually mattered. Are you doing this because it's right, or because some part of you is hoping this finally makes your parents choose you over Derek? I told her, honestly, probably both. She didn't tell me to slow down. She just said, then make peace with the fact that only one of those two outcomes is actually guaranteed, and poured us both another cup of tea, because neither of us particularly wanted wine that night. Meg checked in every few weeks after that, usually with the same 3-word text, case still open? And for 11 months my answer stayed roughly the same, still building it. She never once pushed for more detail than that, and she never once let more than 3 weeks pass without asking again. Lauren's investigation unfolded slowly, exactly the way she'd warned me it would. She subpoenaed 3 years of bank records tied to Nell's accounts, tracing a pattern of transfers into an account belonging to Derek's contracting business, Whitaker Home Renovations, which, court records I later learned Lauren had also pulled, had been sued twice in the past 2 years by unhappy clients, and was carrying significant unpaid debt to at least one supplier. Nearly $170,000 had moved out of Nell's savings over 3 years, in amounts small enough, individually, that no single transaction alone would have raised a flag anywhere. $40 here, $60 there, the occasional larger transfer explained away as home repairs or medical costs that never quite matched anything on Nell's actual calendar. Lauren also pulled the realty listing paperwork directly from the agency's file, confirming Derek had signed as attorney-in-fact using the power of attorney document, listing the house at nearly $40,000 under its actual assessed value, structured specifically for a fast, uncomplicated cash sale. She interviewed the listing agent, who told her, apparently without much hesitation, that Derek had described the timeline as urgent and had never once brought Nell to view the paperwork in person, let alone walk through the house with a prospective buyer. Lauren interviewed Nell alone on 4 separate occasions over that year, twice at the farmhouse when Derek happened to be out, and twice at Nell's own request at a diner in town, a detail Lauren mentioned to me only once she was legally able to. "Your grandmother is sharper than your family gives her credit for," she told me. "She knows more than she's been letting on. I think she's been protecting herself the only way she knew how, which was staying quiet until someone she trusted actually asked the right questions." For those 11 months, I kept showing up to the same Sunday dinners, the same holidays, all while carrying a piece of knowledge none of them knew I had. There were ordinary Tuesday evenings where my mother would call just to talk about nothing, warm and completely unaware, while some quieter part of me sat with the plain fact that a caseworker 2 counties over was, at that exact moment, building a file that would eventually end my brother's access to our grandmother's finances entirely. I remember one Sunday dinner in August in particular, sitting at Nell's own table, watching Derek help himself to a second plate of her scalloped potatoes, laughing easily at something my father said, while some quieter part of me sat there doing arithmetic nobody else at that table could see. Nearly $170,000, 4 documented visits, 1 substantiation still months from finalizing. It is a strange, specific kind of loneliness, being the only person in a room who understands what the room actually is. My family, meanwhile, had started quietly excluding me from things in a way I noticed, but couldn't yet prove had anything to do with what I'd filed. I stopped being told about certain doctor's appointments. I found out, secondhand from Marjorie of all people, that Nell had celebrated her birthday in October with a small family gathering I was never once invited to, my mother later explaining it as, "just something small and last minute, you'd have been busy anyway." Derek stopped mentioning Nell's day-to-day details at family dinners the way he used to. The same way you stop mentioning things to someone once you've decided, quietly, that they're no longer entirely on your side. At Thanksgiving that year, my mother mentioned, almost too casually, that she'd heard I'd been asking around about Nell's finances, and asked, not unkindly but not gently either, whether I had some kind of problem with how Derek was handling things. I told her I just wanted to make sure Grandma was taken care of properly. She said, "She is taken care of, Sloan. You always need something to fix. Not everything is a case." If you've ever watched people you love build an entire story about your motives, instead of ever once asking about the actual facts, tell me in the comments. And if this one's doing what I think it's doing to your evening, hit subscribe, because Christmas is coming, and you're going to want to see exactly how far this goes. In early December, Lauren called to tell me the investigation had substantiated the exploitation claim and that the department's legal team, working alongside the county, had petitioned the court for an emergency suspension of Derek's power of attorney, along with a formal request for restitution. "These things tend to move once they're substantiated," she told me. "But the actual hearing and any asset freeze still take time to finalize through the court. I wanted you to hear that from me directly, since you're the one who got this started in the first place." I asked her if there was any way to know exactly when it would all become visible to my family. She told me there wasn't, not precisely. It depended on court scheduling and a dozen logistics that had nothing to do with me at all. What Lauren did tell me, because Wisconsin's process requires a final in-person interview with the elder party before any protective order is formally executed, was that a caseworker, very possibly her, though APS doesn't guarantee which staff member conducts a given visit, Would need to conduct one more unannounced visit with Nell sometime before the order could be finalized, specifically without advance notice to the family, precisely so nobody could coach or pressure Nell beforehand. It could be any day in the next few weeks, she said. I understood, hanging up that call, that I had absolutely no way to predict whether that day would fall before, during, or after Christmas. I spent the better part of that week doing the same quiet arithmetic I imagine anyone in my position would, running through every date on the calendar between then and New Year's, understanding finally that there was simply nothing productive to do with that uncertainty except keep living my life and let the timing land wherever it landed. I gave my formal statement to the county attorney's office in early December, walking through 11 months of my own documentation out loud for the record, and Lauren told me afterward that it was among the most thorough intake files she'd received in her 6 years on the job. Christmas dinner had been on the family calendar for a month by the time that call came in. The same farmhouse, the same table, the same ham my mother has made every year since before I was born. I considered, for exactly one evening, finding a reason not to go. Meg talked me through it over the phone, the same way she'd talked me through everything else that year. You don't have to hide from your own grandmother's Christmas because of something you didn't do wrong, she said. Whatever happens, happens. You're allowed to just go have dinner with your grandmother. She made me say out loud, once, what I'd actually do if the timing landed on that exact day, because she said the version I rehearsed first still sounded like I was preparing for a fight instead of simply showing up. You're not the one who did anything wrong here, Sloane, she told me. Walk in like you already know that. I decided to go, not because I wanted to be there if the timing landed on that exact day, but because I refused to let 11 months of careful, quiet work turn me into someone who flinched away from an ordinary family holiday. I packed a small folder into my bag before I left my apartment that morning. Copies of the bank statements, the realty listing, my own written timeline of the past year. The same folder I still keep in my desk drawer at work now. I told myself it was just habit, the way I never go anywhere important without the paperwork that matters. I think some part of me knew better. If you've ever had to sit at your own family's holiday table carrying proof of exactly what they'd been allowing to happen, while they still believed you knew nothing at all, stay with me. Because what happened next took 11 months to arrive, and you're going to want to see exactly how it landed. Christmas, of all the days on the calendar, was never one I expected to be the one that finally arrived. The drive out to the farmhouse took 25 minutes, the same 25 minutes it had always taken, past the same feed store, the same church, the same stretch of county road where Nell used to point out red-winged blackbirds every spring from the passenger seat, when I was small enough to still be riding in the back. I passed the turnoff to Marjorie Pruitt's old house, dark that evening, and wondered, not for the first time, how many Christmases Marjorie herself had spent wondering why her oldest friend had simply stopped answering. Nothing about the drive itself felt different. That was, somehow, the strangest part of the entire day. Dinner went the way Whitaker family Christmases always went. The good china, Derek's wife, Whitney, asking polite questions about my work that my mother kept gently steering elsewhere. Nell at the head of the table looking smaller than she had the year before, quieter, though her eyes still found mine more than once across the table in a way that felt, for the first time in months, like she actually wanted me there. My father carved the ham the same exact way he does every year, and my mother told the story of the year the oven broke on Christmas morning for what must have been the 15th time, and everyone laughed in the same places they always laugh, and for about 2 hours, it was possible to believe none of the rest of it was actually happening. At one point, clearing plates, Nell caught my hand briefly and squeezed it, the same small gesture she'd used my whole childhood whenever she wanted to tell me something without an audience. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I understood it as its own kind of question. Are you still paying attention? And I squeezed back, once, to answer it. It was somewhere around the pie that my mother leaned over and said, quietly enough that only I could really hear it, that maybe I should think about heading out before dessert got served. We've got some family business to go over with Grandma tonight, she said. Just the 4 of us. It'll go easier without an audience. I asked her, evenly, What kind of family business required an audience of exactly nobody extra? She glanced very briefly toward the driveway outside the window, the way you'd check for a car you were expecting. Just some paperwork, she said. Derek's got someone coming by to help finalize a few things with the house. It's not a big deal, sweetheart. We just want it quiet. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether Nell had actually asked for it to be quiet, or whether that was simply how the family had decided it should go. She didn't quite answer that. She just repeated, a little more firmly, that it would be easier without an audience. I understood, sitting there with a kind of clean, cold clarity, exactly what paperwork she meant. I stood up, went to the coat closet, and pulled my coat off the hanger, because making a scene at my grandmother's Christmas table was never part of the plan I'd spent 11 months building. I was still holding that coat when the doorbell rang. My mother's face changed instantly. Not relief, the specific unraveling of someone who has been listening for one particular sound and hears a different one arrive in its place. She glanced at the driveway again, at the clock on the wall, at my father, who looked equally confused. "That's early," she said, mostly to herself, already moving toward the door. "He said 7. I set my coat back down on the chair. My father opened the door to find a woman in a plain wool coat, holding a leather folio, who introduced herself calmly as Lauren Feldman, from Wisconsin's Adult Protective Services Division, here to conduct a scheduled confidential welfare interview with Eleanor Whitaker as part of an active investigation. She said it plainly, the specific, unhurried language of someone who has done this exact thing more times than she could count, and knows better than to dress it up. Her breath still visible in the cold air behind her, snow just beginning to collect on the shoulders of her coat. "There must be some mistake," my mother said, the same 4 words I imagine most people reach for first, in a room like that one. "We don't know anything about an investigation." "I understand this is a surprise, ma'am," Lauren said, "but I do need to speak with Mrs. Whitaker alone, per the court's requirements. I can wait in the kitchen while she finishes her meal, if that's more comfortable." Derek had gone very still at the table, the specific stillness of a man doing rapid, silent math. My father looked between Lauren and me, and something in his expression shifted the moment he saw my face, because I was not, apparently, managing to look nearly as surprised as everyone else at that table. Derek's wife had set down her fork entirely, glancing between her husband and the doorway, the particular stillness of someone realizing a marriage she thought she understood might not be quite what she'd believed it was. "Sloan," my mother's voice had gone thin. "Did you know about this?" "I filed the report 11 months ago," I said. "I've known since March that this day was coming. I just didn't know it would be tonight." The table went completely silent, the specific way a room goes quiet, when everyone in it is trying to decide whether they heard something correctly. 4 seconds. I counted them, the same way I count everything, because counting is the only thing that keeps my hands steady when the rest of me wants to shake. "You reported your own brother?" Derek's voice cracked slightly on the word brother, like the word itself had suddenly become unfamiliar in his mouth. "I reported what I found," I said, "which was nearly $170,000 moved out of Grandma's accounts into your business over 3 years, and a house listed for sale that she has no real memory of agreeing to." "You've been investigating me," he said, "like I'm one of your clients, like I'm a stranger." "I documented facts," I said, "the same way I would for anyone. I didn't enjoy a single day of it, Derek, if that's what you're asking." My mother's hand went to the table's edge, steadying herself against it. "That's not— Derek's been handling things. He's been helping her." "Mom," I said. "Nell tried to call Marjorie Pruitt a dozen times last year. Derek told Marjorie at the door that Grandma wasn't up for visitors. Grandma spent an entire year thinking her oldest friend had simply stopped caring about her." Nell, at the head of the table, had gone very quiet, her hands folded in her lap, watching all of this unfold with an expression that was somehow both frightened and, underneath that, something closer to relief. The specific look of a person who has been waiting a long time for someone else to finally say the thing out loud. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd carried in that morning, setting it on the table beside the half-eaten pie. This is the wire transfer history from Grandma's savings account, I said, laying the first page down. Every transfer traces to an account belonging to Whitaker Home Renovations. The pattern starts 8 months after Derek took power of attorney and hasn't stopped since. Derek's wife had gone very still beside him, staring at the page like it might rearrange itself into a version of this dinner she could survive. I laid the second item down beside it, the realty listing agreement, dated, Derek's signature at the bottom as attorney in fact. This is the house, I said. Listed 2 counties over, with an agent none of us have ever heard Grandma mention, at a price well under what that property is actually worth, structured for a fast cash close. Grandma has no memory of agreeing to sell her own home, because as far as I can tell, she never actually did, not in any way that counts. My father's face had gone pale in a way I had never once seen from him. Derek, he said slowly, is this true? It's not what it looks like, Derek said, and his voice had the particular thinness of a man reaching for a sentence he hadn't actually prepared. The business needed a bridge loan. I was always going to pay it back once things stabilized. You don't take a bridge loan from your grandmother's retirement savings without telling her, I said. That's not a loan, Derek. That's exactly what Lauren's report is going to call it. I laid the third item down last because you saved the heart for the end. The formal notice of the substantiated Adult Protective Services finding, the court petition for emergency suspension of power of attorney, case number stamped in the corner. This is why Lauren's actually here tonight, I said. Not for pie. The court has already found probable cause. Tonight's interview is the final step before the suspension becomes official. Nobody spoke. Lauren, standing quietly near the doorway, had let the silence run its full course, the way professionals do when they understand that the interview they came to conduct has, for the moment, become the least important thing happening in that room. My mother's face cracked, just once, just for a second. Not performance, something real and frightened underneath it. The look of a woman realizing the story she'd told herself for 3 years had just been read back to her by the one person who'd actually kept every receipt. Then it closed back over, fast, the way a wound closes before a person is ready to let it heal. You could have come to us first, she said. Before all of this, before strangers. I did come to you first, I said. At Easter 2 years ago. You told me not everything needs to be a legal matter. You told me I always need something to fix. I heard you the first time, Mom. I just didn't agree. That's when Nell finally spoke, her voice quiet but entirely steady, the same voice she'd used to quiet an entire 4th-grade classroom for 31 years. I knew something wasn't right, she said. I just didn't trust my own memory enough to say so out loud. I kept thinking, if I said something and I was wrong, everyone would say I was the confused one, so I stopped saying anything at all. She looked around the table slowly, at my father, at my mother, at Derek, before her eyes settled on me. Sloane asked me questions like she actually wanted the real answer. Nobody else did. I noticed that, you know. I notice more than anyone in this family seems to think I do. Derek's face had gone through several versions of itself in the space of a minute, landing finally on something quieter than defensiveness. I never meant for it to get this big, he said. It started as $5,000 I was going to pay back in a month. Then it was 10. I kept telling myself the next contract would fix it before anyone had to know. That's not an excuse, I said. But I believe that's probably true. It doesn't change what Lauren is here to do tonight. Lauren stepped forward then, gently, and asked if she could speak with Mrs. Whitaker privately, per the court's requirements, whenever she was ready. Nell nodded, rose slowly from her chair, and paused beside me on her way to the kitchen, resting one hand briefly on my shoulder. Thank you for being the one who actually looked, she said, quiet enough that it was mostly just for me. If you've ever had to prove, calmly, in front of your entire family, something the people you love never once expected you to find, stay with me, because the months after taught me almost as much as that table did. Lauren's interview with Nell that night, conducted alone in the kitchen while the rest of us sat in near silence around a half-eaten pie, confirmed everything the investigation had already substantiated. The court formally suspended Derek's power of attorney 3 days later, appointing a neutral, court-supervised guardian ad litem to oversee Nell's finances going forward until a permanent arrangement could be established, one that Nell herself, notably, would have final say in choosing. The guardian ad litem, a calm, methodical woman named Carol Pemberton, spent her first 2 visits simply sitting with Nell at the kitchen table, asking what Nell herself actually wanted her remaining money to do, rather than what anyone else believed was best for her. A question, Nell told me afterward, that nobody had bothered to ask her directly in over 3 years. The house listing was withdrawn within the week. Derek was ordered to begin structured restitution payments, a process his attorney told the court would likely take years given the current state of his business, though the court made clear that bankruptcy would not discharge the debt. The weeks after Christmas were quieter than I expected, the way weeks after any storm tend to be. My father called me twice that first week, both times mostly to say he didn't know what to say, which I understood better than he probably realized. By the third call, he'd started asking real questions instead: how guardianship actually worked now, what he could do to help Nell feel secure again, whether there was anything he should have caught sooner. I told him the truth, that I didn't think he'd known the full scope of it, and that not knowing wasn't the same as being innocent of everything, but it also wasn't the same as guilt. He drove out to see Nell every Saturday morning now, something he hadn't done consistently in years, and told me once that he'd started doing it because he finally understood how easily a person could stop noticing someone right in front of them. My mother has called every week since, and the calls have gotten longer, the way conversations do once 2 people finally stop performing a version of a relationship neither of them entirely believed in. She asked me, on one of those calls, whether I'd ever have told them any of it if Lauren's visit hadn't landed on Christmas night by pure scheduling coincidence. I told her the truth, that I'd have told them the moment the court finalized things regardless, because the truth was always going to reach that table eventually. She didn't argue with that. I think some part of her understood it better than she let on. Derek and I have had exactly one real conversation since, sitting on Nell's porch on a Sunday in February, both of us wrapped in the same wool blankets Nell keeps folded on the porch swing for exactly that purpose. He told me he'd known, almost from the beginning, that what he was doing had a name, and that he'd simply kept finding smaller, gentler names for it instead. A loan, a bridge, a temporary fix, until the real name became too large to keep avoiding. The first time it really was just $5,000, he said, staring out at the same field we used to play in as kids. I told myself I'd have it back before she ever needed it for anything. Then the next contract fell through, and the number just kept getting bigger, and at some point it felt too big to tell anyone about, so I just kept hoping the next job would fix it before I had to. He was quiet for a moment before he added, I should have just told someone I was drowning. Instead, I decided to drown quietly and hope nobody noticed until I'd already fixed it myself. I told him I understood that impulse better than he probably realized, even if I could never fully excuse where it led him. He's since sold the business, taken a job as a project manager for a larger regional contractor, and started a restitution payment plan he's stayed current on for 5 months running, which Lauren tells me is longer than most. Marjorie Pruitt has been visiting Nell every Tuesday since January, exactly the way she used to, and the 2 of them have apparently started a new book club with 3 other women from the old neighborhood, meeting at Nell's kitchen table, the same table where I used to do my own homework as a kid. Nell told me, the last time I visited, that she'd finally started sleeping through the night again, something she hadn't realized she'd stopped doing until it came back. Whitney called me in January too, mostly to say she was staying with Derek but wanted me to know she hadn't known any of it either, and that she'd be the one keeping an eye on things from now on, quietly, in her own way. I believe her. I think she meant it as a promise as much as an explanation, and in the months since, she's been the one who calls me first whenever there's actual news to share, rather than waiting for someone else to decide what I'm allowed to know. The court-appointed guardian ad litem, a calm, thorough woman Nell has taken an immediate liking to, helped her set up a modest, well-protected trust for her remaining funds, with Nell herself choosing, deliberately and clearly, exactly how she wants the rest handled going forward. Meg still texts me the same 3 words every few weeks, out of habit more than necessity now. Case still open? And I've started answering with 3 different words back. Closed. Stayed closed. She sent me, the week after Christmas, a single line in response. Told you that you'd know exactly when to walk back in. I did. Barbara still asks about the case sometimes, mostly checking the way she checks on every file that's actually closed, wanting to know it stayed that way. I told her recently that it has. She said, in the same measured voice she's used with me since my first year at the firm, "Good. That's the only kind of ending this work is actually for." She's since started asking me to sit in on new associates' first exploitation cases, the same way she once let me sit in on hers, and I try, every time, to give them the same plain, patient version of the truth she once gave me. Here's what a career spent protecting other people's parents and grandparents, and 1 year spent finally protecting my own, taught me. Somebody telling you that you always need something to fix isn't proof that you're the one with the problem. Sometimes it's proof that they'd rather you stop looking than face what you'd actually find. It took me 3 years to finally separate those 2 things from each other, sitting at my own grandmother's Christmas table, with a caseworker standing quietly by the door, holding the paperwork that finally said so in writing. I don't regret how long it took to get there. I only regret that it took a stranger showing up on Christmas night, instead of a family simply willing to listen, to finally make the truth impossible to keep quiet. Some rooms only ever get honest once somebody from outside them is finally allowed to walk in. I think about Dorothy Lindqvist sometimes, still, all these years later, and about how she kept sending that card every Christmas anyway. I understand that impulse a little better now than I did back in that clinic. Love and harm can come from the exact same hands. Naming one doesn't erase the other, and it was never supposed to. If you've ever had to quietly build a case for someone who couldn't yet build one for themselves, comment the next guest, so I know you're still with me. And if this one landed the way I think it did, share it with somebody who's been carrying their own quiet file, waiting for the right table to finally set it down on. Nell still keeps her radio tuned to the same classical station, still keeps a plate of burnt sugar cookies ready most Sundays, and I still show up expecting nothing more complicated than her company, the same way I always did before any of this began. I've started bringing her mail in myself every single visit now, out of habit as much as anything, and she always thanks me the exact same way, like it's the first time anyone's ever thought to do it. I'll see you again very soon in the next one.